You're worthless. The words, spoken in that gravelly, dismissive tone, weren't directed at me, not exactly. They were aimed at my sister, Sarah, during a hushed, tense conversation I'd accidentally overheard through the thin kitchen door a few months prior. But the venom, the utter contempt, felt like it was cast wide, encompassing anyone within earshot, anyone unfortunate enough to be entangled with her husband, Mark. My future brother-in-law. The man who, just last week, had stood at the altar, beaming, as Sarah vowed her life to him. My stomach had clenched then, a tiny, premonitory knot, as I watched him. Even then, something felt off, like a warped reflection in a funhouse mirror. He was all polished charm on the outside, a facade that hid a brittle core of entitlement. My own life was a quiet hum of predictable routines. I worked as a librarian, a job that suited my preference for order and the comforting silence of well-worn pages. My apartment was small but meticulously kept, filled with plants I talked to and books that offered endless companionship. Sarah and I were close, or at least I thought we were. We'd navigated childhood's scraped knees and teenage angst together, a sisterly bond forged in shared secrets and late-night phone calls. Lately, though, there was a subtle shift. Sarah seemed smaller. More anxious. She'd started to defer to Mark in ways that felt unnatural, her bright spirit dulled by a constant undercurrent of his approval-seeking. It was like watching a flower slowly close its petals, afraid of the sun. Mark, on the other hand, was a gravitational force of self-importance. He worked in finance, a world I barely understood, but one he spoke of with the reverence usually reserved for religious texts. He was from a family that possessed inherited wealth, old money that had, in his mind, bought him an inherent superiority. My own family was comfortably middle-class, stable, but never ostentatious. Mark treated our family gatherings like charity events, polite but detached, his eyes always scanning for an escape route or a more important person to engage with. He'd often make pointed remarks, veiled criticisms that he'd pass off as jokes. I remembered one Thanksgiving, Sarah had proudly shown off a small painting she'd made, a vibrant abstract piece. Mark had taken a sip of his wine, then casually said, "Cute. Reminds me of something a child would do." Sarah's face had fallen, but she'd forced a smile. I saw it then, that familiar flicker of shame in her eyes, a reaction I was becoming all too accustomed to. He had a way of chipping away at her confidence, subtly, relentlessly. Another time, we were discussing vacation plans. Sarah had suggested a camping trip, something we'd enjoyed as kids. Mark had scoffed. Camping? Is this amateur hour? I was thinking the Amalfi Coast, or perhaps a private villa in the Maldives. Let's aim a little higher, shall we? Sarah had immediately backtracked, her voice tight. Of course, darling. Whatever you think is best. The eagerness to please, the extinguishing of her own desires, was a pattern that was becoming increasingly clear. I felt a growing unease, a silent protest brewing within me. I watched Sarah shrink, and I hated it. But what could I do? He was her husband. My sister's choice. Interference felt like a violation. The wedding was a lavish affair, a testament to Mark's family's wealth and his own carefully cultivated image. He'd insisted on every detail, from the imported orchids to the string quartet playing obscure Baroque composers. Sarah looked beautiful, a radiant bride, but beneath the veil, I saw a flicker of apprehension. She kept glancing at Mark, as if seeking his silent approval. During the reception, I found myself positioned at a table that was a strange mix of my family and his. His parents, stiff and aloof, offered polite nods. His uncle, a man who looked perpetually bored, nursed a glass of champagne. And then there was Mark, radiating a smug satisfaction, holding court with his finance buddies. The speeches began. My parents gave heartfelt tributes, my father cracking jokes that made Sarah blush and Mark roll his eyes. Then, it was my turn. I stood, took a deep breath, and looked out at the sea of faces. Sarah's. Mark's. His family. I'd spent weeks crafting my speech, wanting to capture the essence of my sister, her kindness, her resilience, her infectious laughter. But a darker thread had woven its way in. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not looking for it. I spoke of Sarah's strength, her ability to navigate difficult waters. I spoke of her unwavering loyalty, her capacity for love. And then, I spoke of the importance of choosing partners who lift you up, who see your worth, not diminish it. I spoke of the foundation of respect, the bedrock of any lasting union. I didn't name names. I didn't point fingers. But the message was clear, a whispered truth in the gilded ballroom. I saw it in Mark's eyes. The initial flicker of mild annoyance as I spoke of Sarah's strength, morphing into something sharp and predatory as I touched upon partnership and respect. His smile faltered, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. He leaned over to his father, muttering something, his face flushed. His father just nodded, an expression of grim understanding. The air in the room seemed to thicken, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. As I finished, a strange silence hung for a beat too long before polite applause rippled through the room. Sarah gave me a shaky smile, a mixture of relief and something I couldn't quite decipher. I caught Mark's gaze. His eyes, usually so confident, now held a glint of something colder, harder. It was a look of pure, unadulterated fury, masked by a veneer of cultivated civility. He knew. And he hated it. The wedding was over, the honeymoon phase for Sarah and Mark was in full swing, and I thought that was the end of it. But the incident with the wedding speech had created a ripple. Mark's family, particularly his father, had always seen me as a bit of an outsider, the lesser sibling. Now, I was a perceived threat. The subtle digs at family dinners intensified. Mark himself became more overtly dismissive. He'd started a new venture, a tech startup that was supposedly revolutionary, and he'd made it clear he was the mastermind, the visionary. He'd even approached Sarah about investing a significant portion of her inheritance, money she'd received from our grandmother. Sarah, ever the appeaser, was hesitant. She confided in me, her voice strained. He says it's a guaranteed return, that it will set us up for life. But it feels like so much, and Grandma left it for me, for us. I urged caution, reiterating the importance of independent financial advice, but I could hear the conflict in her voice. She was already being swayed by Mark's conviction, his persuasive charm. Then came the final straw. Sarah's grandmother's house, a beautiful old property that had been in our family for generations, was up for sale. Sarah and I had always envisioned keeping it, a place for family gatherings, a piece of our history. Mark, however, had other plans. He saw it as a financial asset, a way to liquidate dormant capital. He'd presented Sarah with a stack of papers, a formal offer for the house, significantly below market value, from a shell corporation he'd set up. "It's a smart move, darling," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You can put the cash straight into the startup. Think of the exponential growth." Sarah was visibly distressed. She'd called me, weeping. "He's not even asking me, he's telling me. He says I'm being sentimental and irrational." That's when I decided enough was enough. I wasn't going to let him dismantle Sarah's life, her inheritance, her very sense of self, piece by piece. I remembered a clause in Grandma's will, a detail I'd meticulously noted during the estate settlement. It stipulated that any sale of the property must be conducted at fair market value, and any discrepancy would require the executor's explicit approval. And the executor? Me. I didn't confront Mark directly. Confrontation was his game, his arena. My revenge would be silent, precise, and delivered with the chilling finality of a perfectly executed legal maneuver. I waited. I watched him strategize, manipulate, and charm Sarah into a corner. I let him believe he was in control. Then, the day before the contract was due to be signed, I made my move. I contacted Sarah, not with anger or accusation, but with a calm, measured tone. "Sarah," I said, "I need you to meet me at Grandma's house tomorrow morning. Bring the contract Mark gave you." Her voice trembled. What is it? Is something wrong? Just be there, I replied, my voice unwavering. The next morning, the sun streamed through the dusty windows of Grandma's old house. Sarah arrived, looking pale and anxious, the contract clutched in her hand. Mark wasn't with her. He was likely at his office, preparing for his triumphant acquisition. I greeted her warmly, then led her to the antique oak table in the dining room, the same table where we'd shared countless family meals. I sat down, and with deliberate slowness, I opened a folder. Inside were documents, a certified appraisal of Grandma's house, conducted by an independent firm, valuing it at a figure significantly higher than Mark's offer. Beside it was a copy of Grandma's will, with my signature as executor clearly visible. I laid out the appraisal, then the will. Sarah, I said, my voice low and steady, Grandma's will states that the property must be sold at fair market value. And any sale at a price below that requires my explicit approval as executor. I then placed the contract Mark had given her on the table, the one detailing his lowball offer. I have reviewed this offer. Based on the appraisal, it is not fair market value. I looked her in the eye. Therefore, I do not approve it. The color drain. D from Sarah's face. She looked from the documents to me, then back again. The sheer simplicity of it, the absolute finality, seemed to stun her. She didn't need to say anything. I saw the realization dawn, the crumbling of Mark's meticulously constructed plan. He had underestimated me. He had underestimated the power of a simple clause, the authority of a determined executor. He told me. She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. He told you what he wanted you to believe, I said, gathering the papers. But the will is the law here, Sarah. And I am upholding it. I stood up. You can ask Mark if he wants to make a legitimate offer, one that reflects the true value of this house. Otherwise, I will be listing it on the open market at the appraised price. The aftermath was a whirlwind, not of shouting matches or dramatic confrontations, but of silent, destructive consequences. Mark's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by a torrent of angry texts and calls to Sarah, demanding she pressure me. Sarah, for the first time, seemed to find a sliver of strength. She refused to bend. It's Grandma's house, she told him, her voice firm. And it's going to be sold fairly. Mark's father, the silent partner in his arrogance, tried to intervene, calling me with veiled threats about legal repercussions and familial rifts. I calmly reiterated the terms of the will and the appraisal, refusing to engage with his bluster. He quickly realized he had no leverage. His carefully cultivated image of power was built on intimidation, and that was no longer effective. The true panic set in when Mark realized his startup was hemorrhaging money. Without the substantial injection of Sarah's inheritance, his revolutionary venture was on the brink of collapse. The investors he'd wooed with promises of rapid returns began to pull out, their confidence shaken by the faltering foundation. His finances, once a source of immense pride, became a gaping chasm. Sarah eventually sold the house, not to Mark, but to a young couple who promised to cherish its history. She reinvested the proceeds wisely, with independent advice, securing her own future. Mark's calls to Sarah dwindled, replaced by increasingly desperate pleas for financial assistance, which she politely declined. The smug self-assurance that had once radiated from him was replaced by a desperate anxiety. His reputation in his financial circles, built on a foundation of inherited wealth and perceived success, began to crumble. He had underestimated the power of quiet resolve, of a calm execution of a rightful claim. He had believed his entitlement was a shield, but it turned out to be a cage. There's a quiet satisfaction in seeing justice served, not through grand gestures or public humiliation, but through the steady, implacable force of truth and consequence. Mark's grand pronouncements, his condescending pronouncements, his belief in his own inherent superiority, all dissolved in the face of a simple, unyielding document. He called me worthless. He was wrong. I was simply an executor, a guardian of legacy, and a sister who refused to stand by and watch her family's inheritance, and her sister's spirit be devalued. The silence that followed his downfall was deafening, a stark contrast to the cacophony of his self-importance. And in that silence there was a profound, unshakable peace.